Hey guys, in this video we have a 2002 Honda Odyssey van that is my mom's car. And the problem that we're having in it is having a hard time turning on, and it was throwing a check engine light at one point. And so I plugged in the OBD2 sensor or scanner, and I am getting this error code P0118. And this corresponds to having a bad engine coolant temperature sensor. And previous to this, it was also throwing a P0128 error code, which is indicative of another potential ECT temp sensor or the thermostat. And so what we're going to be doing is replacing both the engine coolant temperature sensor as well as the thermostat in this car. And to do that, the very first thing you're going to want to make a note of is if you have the stock radio, which we do, make note of what the code is so that when you disconnect your battery, you will be able to unlock your radio and use it. If you don't do this, you're going to have to put in a new radio because you won't know what your radio code is, or you may have to take out the stock radio and keep working on it. So that is one thing you're going to want to do. The other thing you're going to want to do is make sure you have the correct tools, or whatever you call these things. We have a bucket here. This is to collect the coolant, because we will be draining the coolant to do this job. In addition to that, I have a new coolant temperature sensor for this car, as well as a Gates thermostat. And when you buy these thermostats, you're going to want to make sure that you are getting a new gasket with it, just because it's best practice to replace everything, especially on this car that has over 250,000 miles on it. So I'm just going to replace both these things because they were pretty cheap. You'll also want to have some new coolant to put back into your car, pre-diluted or concentrated, doesn't really matter. Just make sure you get it the appropriate concentration. And then to actually do this job, the very first thing you're going to be doing is disconnecting the battery, because we're going to want to get this battery out, because if you can see that metal block in the middle right there with these that main heater hose going in, that is the unit that we're going to be taking off. And there are two, I believe those are 10 mil or 12 mil bolts holding it on either side. So you disconnect those, and then this thing right there on that same thing is the actual engine coolant temperature sensor that you will be replacing. So to get access to it is pretty straightforward. You just take out this battery. Before you take this off the engine block though, you do want to drain your coolant, otherwise all your coolant will get dumped out here. So disconnect the battery is step one. Step two will be going underneath the car and actually draining the coolant. So there's going to be a little white wing nut on the bottom of the radiator somewhere. And so you do that, collect the coolant into a bucket, and then we're going to take this thing off. You will still have some residual coolant and spillage, so that's the reason why you should purchase some extra coolant when you're refilling your system. And so we'll cut to the next scene where we're actually making some progress getting this battery out. Okay, so underneath the car, to actually drain the radiator, you're gonna want to jack it up and support it. And after you've done that, what you will find is a white wing nut. And if you can see it right there, this thing you just undo counterclockwise, and then fluid will start pouring out of this drain hole right here, and that is your engine coolant. So you want to place a bucket or anything right here to collect it, and that's how you get the engine coolant drained. So after loosening up the white wing nuts on the bottom of the radiator, you should start seeing your radiator fluid come out. What you can do to expedite the process is give an air gap in your circuit. So just open up this cap here. This car might have some other problems because of how orange this stuff is. It's a little bit worrying, but for now I'll just focus on the job at hand. And then in terms of getting the battery off, the way we do that is by, if you have these little covers on, you're going to lift it up. You should have like a 10 mil bolt on this thing. You don't need to take the bolt off, you just need to loosen it after you loosen it, this thing just comes off like that, and you want to make sure that it doesn't contact the battery, so put it down so it's not going to retouch the battery. Same goes for this black one. You just loosen up this 10mm bolt right here. This comes right off like so, and then you just get this wire out of the way. And the next thing you're going to do is loosen up these two 10mm bolts right here to get the metal bracket right here off, and then this battery will just lift up and out of the way. Okay, so after we get the battery out, there should be a plastic tray between the actual battery and the metal bracket that holds it in place. The reason for this plastic tray is the sulfuric acid that's used in your battery, so you do want to be careful when you're handling this stuff, and you will probably burn your clothes or your hands, so very low pH stuff. So keep it around this plastic thing. And the next thing we're going to be doing is actually getting out this housing that contains the coolant. So we've got our coolant hose right here, and what we need to do now is get this little pipe out of the way and undo the two bolts that hold in this housing. So you can see one of them right there, and there's another one on the other side of this, and then in addition to that, there is this electrical connector that hopefully you can see. This is the electrical connection between the wiring harness and your engine coolant temperature sensor. So this right here is the engine coolant temperature sensor. So you're going to disconnect this wire, and then we're also going to unclamp this hose, get this off, and then take off these two bolts, and we'll get this housing out so we can actually get to the thermostat, which is going to be nested in here, and then we can also replace the actual engine coolant temperature sensor right here. So the hardest part of this job so far is getting the second bolt off of this metal bracket here that holds the coolant hose onto the engine block. So you have the obvious bolt right here. There's a second bolt on the other side, 10mm, and you gotta use Braille basically to figure out where it is, because you really don't have any good access to it. So I very carefully got a 10mm thing around it, and then I have this nice ratchet here to help me get this bolt off. But this is definitely one of the harder areas to get to, but there is a bolt there that needs to come off in order to get this whole thing to come off. You can leave the coolant hose on because this part will come off, so you don't need to worry about that. But yeah, so if you get stuck at this, just keep going and trying, and hopefully you're able to get a 10mm around that bolt. Maybe you can see it with the video camera, but there it is on the other side, and good luck. So after we get those two 10mm bolts off, this thing should detach from the engine block. We can see our thermostat right there in place. There is actually an additional 10mm bolt on this thing, which we can see right there. That 10mm bolt holds something for grounding cables on the wiring harness, so you will need to take that off as well. The two bolts that held on the front, the two bolts here and on the other side are the same length, but you don't need to worry about that one, but this third one right there might be a different length, so you would want to keep track of that. Okay, and so after getting this bolt off, which was the one holding the ground on, as well as the two other bolts that hold the actual bracket onto the engine block, the thing does detach. This is your coolant temperature sensor with the harness disconnected, and then getting off this hosing pipe did take me a few minutes. I used a flathead screwdriver, just kind of pry it, kept turning it, and now this thing comes out pretty easily now that you have better access to it. So if you're going to do this on your own car, I do recommend take this bracket off first and then take the hose off. Getting the hose off, leaving this bracket attached is just too much of a pain in the ass. So the lesson that I just learned the hard way is that this temperature sensor right here has nothing to do with the engine coolant temperature sensor. It is actually another sensor called the Thermostat Fan Switch, and so it's named because it's very close to the thermostat. The threads are different from the threads that you will find on a engine coolant temperature switch. So this is actually not the appropriate sensor that we're going to be replacing, and I'll have to get back on where the actual sensor is that we do need to replace. So this is going to go back in. There is a, if you did the same mistake I made, there is a O-ring on this side that has to be in place, and then just use a crescent wrench to actually torque this down, and we can put this back in the car, and also make sure to replace the actual thing that we came in to replace, which was the engine coolant temperature sensor in this box. Also, when you are replacing the thermostat with the new one, there should be a little bump, and this bump will be at the top of the engine block, so make sure you put it in the right way, because it clearly looks like the engineers behind this wanted it to go in not like that, but like that. Okay, and this should sit in there pretty nicely, and now we can actually install this item back into here. Alright, so after putting back in the bolts, the 3 bolts for this bracket that holds on the engine coolant hose, as well as this sensor here, and the lesson learned was that this sensor that I have my finger on right now is not the engine coolant temperature sensor. It is actually called the Thermostat Fan Switch sensor. So it's going to tell your fan when to kick on when your engine coolant temperature gets too high. The actual engine coolant temperature sensor is right in there with my finger pointing to it. So to get to that, to actually resolve the error code that we had, it looks like we need to take this plastic off. So I'm just going to take off the obvious 4 bolts holding that on, as well as the 2 bolts here, and hopefully we'll have enough access to get to this sensor. And so now that we have the front plastic cover off, that was just the 4 bolts, you don't need to take these 2 off. We do have excellent access now to the engine coolant sensor right here, and I've already popped the clip, so this should just come off like that. You just push down this tab from the other side with your finger and it releases, and now we can put a 19 mil socket, if we can get this thing to focus, around that, undo that, put in the new engine coolant temperature sensor, plug this back in, put the plastic cover back on, and then refill your coolant, and you should be set to go. Okay, so after putting the housing back on and then reconnecting the battery, putting this bracket back on, connecting the 2 terminal leads on the battery, and then finally topping up the engine coolant, you are ready to actually start the car. And what I do recommend is, if you are seeing the P0118 error code or P0128 error code, you probably want to connect your OBD2 sensor and then erase the codes and let the car run for a bit, and that should take away your check engine lights. So if you made it this far, you're done, and we just got installed that new engine coolant temperature sensor, which hopefully we can see deep down in there. During the process, we also changed the thermostat, and if we needed to, we could have replaced the sensor right there that you can not really see because it's not in focus, but that sensor was the Thermostat Fan Switch. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I hope this was useful.